Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. President Biden says he wants a two-state solution for Palestinians and Israelis, but does anybody believe it's doable? Let's get to the bottom line. The temporary truce between Hamas and Israel might last, but it's just as likely that Israel will resume its all-out war in its quest to decimate Hamas. The damage done on both sides of this conflict will make it very hard to go back to business as usual when the rockets, the tanks, and the guns stop firing. For decades, despite efforts from the international community, led by the U.S., to address the Palestine-Israel conflict, the result has been that the issue was swept under the rug. No progress, no real horizon of hope for a better Palestinian future, and occasional economic handouts to the Palestinians to just keep the nation living right above survival levels. But no freedom and no prosperity. Now, after about 15,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel and more than 1,200 Israelis were killed by Hamas, this equation just doesn't seem viable anymore. President Joe Biden says he wants to reinvigorate the attempts to create a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. But how? And can Biden succeed where so many other U.S. presidents have failed? Today, we're talking with Mara Rudman, who worked on the ground in the Clinton and Obama administrations for the Middle East peace process, and she's now the Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia. Mara, it's great to have you with us today. Many people under 30 in the United States do not give President Biden a positive grade for the way this crisis is being managed from a U.S. standpoint. You've given President Biden some praise for how he's handling it. Tell us what you see is right that President Biden is doing, and why do you think there's this gap in the United States where so many are not supportive right now?
Sure. Appreciate being here, Steve, and it's a good question. What I think President Biden is doing right is understanding, is applying all of the experience he has, and we know he's got years of experience, or decades, in terms of understanding the dynamics on the ground for both Israelis and Palestinians, working hard in terms of the relationships he has throughout the region and throughout the world, and keeping front and center what United States interests are here. Because to be clear, if you're president of the United States, whatever you're doing in other parts of the world must be dictated by what is going to keep Americans safe and secure.
So let me just interrupt real quick. What are those U.S. interests?
The U.S. interests are a secure and stable Middle East region. We know from our national defense strategy, our national security strategy, that for the United States, the biggest, that we talk about China, let me put it this way, as a pacing competitor and Russia as a chronic threat to us. So those dictate the overall parameters of what we need to do in the world. That doesn't mean abandoning or stepping back from every other region in the world, because the safety and security of the United States and of Americans very much flows from the safety and security of various parts and stability of various parts of the world. And when the United States steps back, China and Russia have shown very clearly that they step in, and in some cases they're doing that before the United States steps back.
I just wonder, what does the U.S. strategy have to be at this point? Because what we were doing clearly did not succeed in creating that stable, positive Middle East that you think is in American national interest.
In the immediate, I think for the United States, there needs to be, and I believe with President Biden there is, a readjustment of thinking in the context of understanding that the United States cannot afford to walk back from various regions of the world, to walk back from our involvement, the intensity of what we're willing to do and how we're willing to do it, both in terms of providing help, but also our diplomatic engagement as well as our security engagement. And I think for some, I don't think this is President Biden's view, but I think for some in the administration, there was a view that because China was our pacing competitor, that somehow meant all resources needed to be maximally and to some extent largely going to the Indo-Pacific region. And
the so-called pivot to Asia, right?
Yes,
right.
But in other words, not just a pivot in focus, but a pivot in resources and attention. I'm of the view, and I think there are many with me in the administration, that, consistent with viewing China as a pacing competitor and recognizing the real threat of Russia, means you have to be vigilant and involved and engaged throughout the world. And so I think that is one of the biggest lessons going forward. We shouldn't have been surprised by what happened on October 7th.
So when it comes to the big issues like occupation and deoccupying or moving settlements, do we have enough leverage over Israel in the temperature it sets or not?
It is challenging always to negotiate with people who are under fire and a country that finds the need to defend itself. And so what President Biden has been able to do through how he has led this, which is a bear hug kind of approach, I'm going to show you in the most visible possible terms that we, the United States, are with you, and I'm going to start by whispering the hard stuff into your ear as I'm hugging you tight. That is just as in personal relationships, in difficult situations. People need to have some degree of trust to then move forward. So what has happened, the amount of humanitarian aid going into Gaza, how it's gone in, David Satterfield, tremendously accomplished diplomat, being appointed to navigate all of that, to me has shown tremendous strength of the United States. And that is part of what will be important going forward. And again, this can't be just the United States. It needs to be the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Saudis.
Well, let's talk about these other
Europe
players. You know, one of
together.
the things that was going on during the Trump administration was the initiation of the Abraham Accords. And a lot of people look at the Abraham Accords and for the Arab world, normalizing with Israel as a net plus for the world and for Israel. But there's also the view that it just leapfrogged over the Palestine issue entirely. Do you see it that way?
I don't see it that way. I also don't see it as just a Trump administration, something that started with the Trump administration. So to be clear,
tell us more. Tell us
more. The name Abraham Accords and the kind of celebration trappings of it, and certainly the Emiratis, and who would be able to tell you far more about it than I could, and the Bahrainis who signed first did so with President Trump. But the basis of that agreement, all of the things that flowed from it, almost all the things that flowed from it, I was discussing and I was seeing Senator George Mitchell as the Middle East peace envoy in the first Obama term talking about. I somewhere have a document, or had a document when I was in government, that lists a number of these things. And so it was a matter of moving forward. President Trump, in this case, or Jared Kushner, was standing on the shoulders of his predecessors in moving forward on this, which is true for most U.S. presidents in foreign policy. President Trump, unlike other presidents, tends not to credit anyone else with his success and blame everyone else for his failures. And so in that case, this was consistent. But the Abraham Accords, I agree with you, provide a very useful framework. And in fact, I'd note that the Emiratis used even their signing of the Accords as something to help Palestinians in the immediate, because this was at a time where the Netanyahu government, prior Netanyahu government, that, believe it or not, was not as right-wing as the current Netanyahu government, was talking about annexing the West Bank. And so the Emiratis, my understanding is a kind of price for signature.
I know that to be the case, that in fact they would not have proceeded if they had not gotten the agreement not to. I don't know how permanent that agreement is.
But it was a public declaration.
Right.
Netanyahu said other things that he doesn't follow up on. But so in that case, but it's an example of using the Palestinian, getting progress on the Palestinian issue through the Abraham Accords. I think other signatories the United States very much wants to have join, for example, the Saudis, have tremendous leverage at this point. If they are really committed to the key aspects of a Palestinian state, and certainly we have the Arab League initiative that was started by the former king of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia at that point, they have the basis for being able to say, you want us in this, here are the things that need to happen with respect to the Palestinians. There's a separate issue for both Palestinian and Israeli leadership of how to get them to the place on both sides where they're capable of actually getting to that horizon of a two-state solution.
Maura, there's another problem percolating, and that's the way the rest of the world looks at this and looks at U.S. values as deployed, and it sort of sees perhaps double standards. Let's listen to this clip with Anthony Blinken speaking at the UN Security Council in February this year.
We must continue to document Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity and share this evidence with investigators and prosecutors so that one day the perpetrators can be held accountable. Day after day of Russia's atrocities, it's easy to become numb to the horror, to lose our ability to feel shock and outrage. But we can never let the crimes Russia's committing become our new normal. Bucha is not normal. Mariupol is not normal. Irpin is not normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal.
So, Mara, you know these principles. I do as well. That, with Tony Blinken, I know him to be sincere about that concern. But we see today in Israel's response to the terror attacks, a kind of acceptance. I think that's been a lot of the criticism of enormous, innocent deaths. And I guess the question is, are we losing, to some degree, call it the global South or many other nations in the world that said, you're with these kinds of values when it's convenient, but not when it's not? What are your thoughts?
So I have a lot of thoughts, Steve, and they start with the problem to me of using that clip and trying to draw an analogy between that clip and what's happening in terms of Israel defending itself in going after Hamas in Gaza. And I will come to the laws of armed conflict and civilian casualties. But that's highly problematic because what you're implying by that clip is that Russia and Israel are alike in what they're doing and how they're doing it. Russia is the country that invaded another country. Israel was responding to the Hamas invasion of Israel.
Right.
And so it's, in terms of the laws of armed conflict, very different situations. But the laws of armed conflict all require that your military ends and means are aligned, and that in pursuing them, you are mitigating to the fullest extent possible civilian casualties.
So how do you better communicate that message? Because people wonder, does the United States have different standards in the way it kind of looks at these issues? And I would tell them, President Biden has been expressing concern about loss of civilian life, et cetera. But I don't see us winning that argument, or at least in a convincing way yet, as nations line up critiquing both Israel and the United States.
I believe what everybody who speaks about this should be doing is speaking with honesty and directness and the greatest clarity possible. I certainly try to do that, and I'm not in government. I just believe strongly in what the United States government is doing and how it's doing it, and I try in as many places as I can. And I think there are many people like me inside and outside of government. I think one of the things, Steve, that it's important to address, though, is the challenges of decades in how the world views Israel versus how they may view the Palestinians. How both entities are used, frankly masked for other views people have and other politics people have, and then layer that on top of the information environment where we live in today. The amount of mis and disinformation we have, the fact that earlier in the show you referenced the younger generation in the United States not supporting President Biden. That same generation, more than a third of them gets their primary news from TikTok, which is controlled by a foreign entity that, again, goes back to is one of the biggest threats to the United States. China ultimately controls TikTok and the information on there. In general in our social media, there is no such thing as the fact-checking that journalists from traditional mainstream media have to go through. And so the amount of mis and disinformation is rampant on ways in which people derive their primary news sources. And so that further complicates the situation, which is why I think ultimately, to answer your question, to go back to one of my favorite bosses, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, if you're a policy leader, you need to figure out what the right thing to do is and then navigate the path to getting there, which includes how you communicate publicly, but you can't allow public reactions to what is often mis and disinformation take you off the path of what you know the right thing to do is.
You worked with Senator George Mitchell, and I have interviewed him many times, and I would ask him about his role in the crisis, and he said, look, we just have to tell both parties, give us a call in 400 years when you have your enlightenment and you kind of grow up and you understand the consequences of fanaticism on both sides. I know you don't share that view, that this is, but do you have any hope that, given what we're seeing unfold today, that we can actually come back and reset a different equilibrium that takes us genuinely in a different direction? Because I'm in a problem right now where I don't see how a two-state solution is viable. I'd love to hear you argue with me. But I also know the status quo is not viable. And I don't know where it goes other than continue to be a convulsive volcano.
Yeah. I strongly disagree with Senator Mitchell's view. Coming back to my point about that, it does not serve American interests.
Right.
That makes the world a much more unstable place. And I do see, I don't know if I'd call it hope, but listen, I'm always all about, and I'm going to use a phrase that may have been coined by former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, so I say it, but I focus on facts on the ground. He used it in reference to settlements. I use it in a very different way. What are the facts that you have, and how can you align them to work towards what your goals are? And so I actually think when we're beyond the immediate conflict, and that is going to involve a lot of careful negotiation and diplomacy, which I believe is ongoing, but I don't think that the truce period we're in now is going to last long term. I wish it would. I think it's unlikely. So when we're beyond this immediate conflict, there will be a reckoning in the Israeli government for sure. And I think it is unlikely that Prime Minister Netanyahu remains Prime Minister after that reckoning. I think it is unlikely that his far-right coalition remains in power. I think what is far more likely is that Benny Gantz, who last time I checked was leading by significant percentage points in polling in Israel, and a kind of centrist government.
So if Gantz came in, tell us what that would change.
So again, it's not an immediate. It's not like, and we shouldn't be talking about there being two states tomorrow.
Right.
But you end up with government whose politics are structured differently. We already know that the Israeli polity writ large was churning over the very threats to the existence of their democracy by judicial overhaul.
Right.
So we know there's a deep commitment in Israeli democracy to what I would say is a democratic state that is a homeland for the Jewish people. If you want those things, you must then get to a Palestinian state. And I would actually suggest people go back and read the speech that President Clinton gave on January 7th, 2001. Because I challenge people who tell me that, pie in the sky, two states, never real, to go back and read that address by President Clinton and tell me what is no longer accurate in that, what is no longer feasible. I would use the parameters that he laid out in that January 7th, 2001 speech as the horizon, and then figure out step by step, which again, we don't have time on this show to do, what we need to do, what outside parties need to do, and how we need to help Palestinians and Israelis get to the point where they could execute on those parameters.
That's a great reference. Let me ask you on the military side of this with Hamas. Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu have set out to destroy Hamas. And the question is it militarily destroyable? And so it raises the question of whether the goal is achievable, particularly when the last election was held in Palestine, Hamas won. So I think part of this question is, do you think there is a pathway politically for something other than Hamas down the road on the Palestine side?
Yes, I do think there's an alternative to Hamas. I know a number of Palestinians in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. And let's be clear, there's no love lost among the bulk of the Palestinian population for Hamas as leaders. They have not led in a way that shows any commitment to the Palestinian people and to the basic needs of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And many, many Palestinians in Gaza would say that even today if they were actually free to be able to speak about it. So I think it's important to hold that thought in mind. I do not think if there was an election on October 6th in Gaza that Hamas would be winning. Yet, again, with the hostage release and the prisoners release, that is accruing to their favor politically. And at the same time, Palestinians
to Hamas's favor.
To Hamas's favor, absolutely. Palestinian prisoners are a huge political issue going back to kind of what different leaders need. It further hurts the Palestinian Authority leadership, Fatah leadership, and President Abbas, and enhances Hamas when prisoners are released in exchange for hostages at 2-to-1 numbers. It's part of the tough trade-offs of the situation that Israel was in to agree to that. Also among Palestinians, no love lost for the Palestinian Authority leadership. So that's a challenge. Listen, I actually think if you ask most Israelis, though, about their own leadership, you'd have similar responses. It's one of the many things that most Palestinians and Israelis have in common. They have been, it has been a long time since either was well represented by their leadership.
Let me ask you finally, I'm interested in the sort of day after questions about stakeholders in this. And as I look at Erdogan of Turkey and his comments about Hamas, supportive of Hamas, to me it looks like positioning for Turkey to be involved in this equation in the future. Maybe I'm wrong. I see China taking surprising stands, out there and maybe appealing to the so-called global South in this area. But do you see Iran, clearly has been involved. Do you see any way in which the U.S. would begin negotiating or bringing in other global stakeholders as part of this? Or is that something that would really undermine American interests?
I would distinguish among the actors that you're talking about. China and Russia have anti-U.S. goals in what they're doing, front and center. Anyone who believes that they care about the Palestinian people or the Israeli people should look a little bit at history, look a lot at what they've done in the last 10 and 20 years, and do some serious rethinking. Turkey is a different situation in the sense that Erdogan's a member of NATO, Turkey's a member of NATO, and Erdogan's position vis-a-vis Hamas is not new, right? I was on the ground for an extended period in June of 2010, I believe, when the flotilla had launched from Turkey to Gaza and created what is, compared to where we are now, a very small-scale set of challenges. But that was instigated by Erdogan in Turkey. So, in one way or another, figuring out how to deal with him because of the role he plays, I think has been ongoing. So I don't think that's something new. The key players on this are Egypt and Jordan for sure, and the Saudis and the Emiratis and others in the region who have shown leadership at various points in time and who have their own internal challenges as well in how they approach this issue.
Well, I want to thank you for your candor and for joining us today. Mara Rudman, former U.S. diplomat for the Middle East peace process and currently the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much.
So what's the bottom line? It seems to me that the only reason leaders still talk about the two-state solution, even when they know deep down in their hearts that it's never going to happen, is because there are no other alternatives. But they also know that the status quo of occupation and injustices are just going to keep exploding. In the end, people need the opportunity to live fulfilling lives with dignity and self-determination. My guess says the U.S. should keep trying, but maybe it's time for other states to weigh in, like Turkey or China. The U.S. just can't credibly deliver for both sides anymore. The world has to up the game and realize that sweeping the Palestine problem under the rug is a real and a global security risk. And that's the bottom line.